My name is Amy Schultz, and I never imagined I would be sobbing outside a fancy restaurant on the night of my own birthday. I grew up in Charleston, South Carolina, in a modest white house surrounded by oak trees draped with Spanish moss. My mom's name is Helen, and she's known around our neighborhood for her knack for planning elaborate get-togethers. My younger sister is Tracy, who is in college and has always seemed to get all of the attention. My father, Stephen, works long hours as an accountant, and he rarely involves himself in our family disputes. For most of my life, I felt overshadowed, as though I could never quite be the center of anyone's thoughts. Yet I tried my best to keep the peace, hoping one day I would truly belong. I work as a marketing manager for a small tech startup in town. My job is stressful, but I have always believed that with enough success at work, I might earn some respect from my family. It was a naive assumption, but I held on to it like a lifeline. On the morning of my 29th birthday, I was busy finishing a few deadlines before heading over to my mom's place. Helen had insisted I come there first because she had arranged a birthday dinner at a new upscale restaurant called Celestial Harbor. She said she'd also rented a charter bus, which sounded so extravagant that I actually felt hopeful. Perhaps this birthday would be different, maybe at last I would feel appreciated. I arrived at my mother's house around 4 in the afternoon. It was warm, the sky streaked with pastel hues as the sun began its slow descent. Tracy was sprawled on the living room couch, texting away, and she barely glanced at me when I walked in. My mother stood near the front door, giving instructions to a uniformed driver about the bus. She looked over at me, nodded, and said, "Finally, you're here, Amy. We have a schedule to keep." There was no happy birthday, no smile, just an air of irritation as though I were late. In truth, I had cut my workday short to arrive earlier than promised, but I let her comments slide. A fight on my birthday was the last thing I wanted. About 15 minutes later, Helen clapped her hands and announced that it was time to board. I followed them outside, seeing a sleek bus parked out front with tinted windows. My spirits lifted slightly. Maybe this would be a nice way to travel to the restaurant together. However, when I climbed the steps, I realized every seat was occupied by my mother's friends and some acquaintances I barely recognized. Tracy lounged in the last available seat, crossing her legs with a smug smile. Confused, I asked if there was a spot for me, and my mother just shrugged. "Oh, it's full," she said, feigning disappointment. "I guess you'll have to find your own way. We really can't delay this trip." Her lips curled into the faintest smile. My heart pounded with a mix of hurt and embarrassment. "Are you serious?" I asked. Tracy smirked and turned her attention back to her phone. Mom tapped the driver's shoulder and said, "We're ready to go." The door hissed shut and the bus pulled away, leaving me alone on the sidewalk. I remember standing there, too shocked to even move for a moment, until I finally gathered my wits and decided to walk to the restaurant. According to my phone's navigation, it would take me about half an hour if I moved quickly. I set off down the street, my nice shoes pinching my feet, trying not to let tears blur my vision. I couldn't believe they would do that to me on my birthday of all days. Each block felt longer than the last, my heart aching not just from the physical exertion but from the realization that my own mother and sister found my presence disposable. By the time I reached Celestial Harbor, the sky had grown darker, and a neon glow from the restaurant's sign lit the sidewalk. My hair was a mess and my feet throbbed, but I tried to compose myself. Inside, the place was elegant, with tall windows overlooking the water. A hostess in a crisp uniform greeted me, and I asked for the reservation under my mother's name. She directed me to a large table near the back, where Helen and Tracy were sipping on cocktails, surrounded by a few acquaintances who chatted happily. I approached, feeling invisible. Tracy finally glanced up, rolling her eyes. Helen gave me a thin smile, then resumed talking to someone about interior design tips. I waited for them to acknowledge me, but no one did. Eventually, I cleared my throat and said, "Hi, I made it." My mother waved me off as though I were a server. "Good, you're here. Now, please be seated." I looked around the table. There was no free chair until one of the acquaintances reluctantly scooted over. My cheeks burned, but I tried to focus on the fact that at least I was here. No sooner had I settled than my mother stood up and began collecting dirty appetizer plates. "We're almost done with these," she said, stacking them in her arms. With a sweet, condescending voice, she handed the stack to me. "Amy, would you mind taking these? Clear them away for us, would you?" The rest of the group watched with mild amusement, Tracy included, who hid a smirk behind her glass. Shocked by the blatant disrespect, I took the plates, trembling with indignation. My voice faltered. "Mom, this is my birthday." "Why are you?" She cut me off with a dismissive wave. "Don't be dramatic, dear. Just do it." Tears pricked my eyes, and I knew if I stayed any longer, I would break down in front of everyone. Holding the plates in my shaking hands, I turned and fled, rushing past a startled waiter, out the main door and onto the sidewalk. The humid night air enveloped me, intensifying my sense of suffocation. I searched for a place to sit, finding a low step near the entrance. Carefully, I put the plates aside, buried my face in my hands, and started to cry. I felt lower than I ever had, humiliated and discarded by the people who were supposed to love me. I'm not sure how many minutes passed before I heard a voice. "Miss, are you all right?" I glanced up and saw a tall man with dark hair, looking down at me with genuine concern. I wiped my tears hastily, embarrassed to be seen in such a state. "I'm fine, Elite." He didn't move, didn't accept my answer. "You seem upset," he said gently. "Can I help?" Something in his voice made me want to confide in him. I sniffled and blurted, "It's my birthday and my family just humiliated me in there. I don't even know why I came." He exhaled softly, as though the situation pained him. "That's awful," he said, taking a seat on the step beside me, leaving a respectful distance. "Nobody should spend their birthday feeling like this." My tears started again, and I tried to hold them back, but the emotional dam had burst. This stranger waited patiently, letting me cry without judgment. Finally, when I managed to speak, I said, "I'm sorry. You don't even know me, and I'm falling apart." He shook his head. "I'm Thomas," he said, offering a hand. "And I think everyone needs a friend sometimes." I hesitated before shaking his hand. "Amy." He smiled. Then he noticed the plates I'd set aside. "I guess they made you play busboy, huh?" he asked, half joking, half appalled. I nodded, a fresh wave of anger coursing through me. They rented a bus to come here, and there was no seat left for me. "I had to walk," I admitted, my voice shaking. Thomas's eyes widened. "They left you behind on your birthday?" I nodded, feeling my cheeks grow hot with humiliation. He shook his head. "That's so wrong." "Wait here a minute," he said abruptly, standing up and jogging off toward a convenience store down the block. Puzzled, I stayed put. My heart pounded from the emotional roller coaster, and I wondered if he would return. Within a few minutes, Thomas came back, carrying a small plastic bag. From it, he produced a little box with a single vanilla cupcake inside. "It's not much," he said, lighting a lone candle on top, "but happy birthday." Make a wish. Overwhelmed, I smiled through fresh tears. It was the sweetest gesture anyone had shown me all evening. I closed my eyes, wishing for the strength to stand up for myself and find a life free from this toxic environment. Then I blew out the candle, feeling a strange sense of hope stir inside me. Thomas patted my shoulder. "No one should spend their birthday crying on the sidewalk," he said. "Look, you don't have to go back in there if you don't want to. You can make a different choice tonight." I felt a wave of relief. I really can't face them right now," I confessed. Thomas nodded sympathetically. "I don't blame you. How about we go someplace quieter? There's a small boutique hotel a few blocks away. It might be better than staying under the same roof as people who don't appreciate you." His offer sounded strangely appealing. Normally, I would never follow a stranger to a hotel, but at that moment, anything seemed better than returning to my mother's scorn. I followed him along the sidewalk, passing the soft glow of street lamps and the buzz of distant traffic. We reached a charming brick building with ivy climbing its walls. A sign reading "The Blue Orchid Inn" hung over the entrance. Inside, the lobby had a cozy warmth, with comfy chairs and art prints of Charleston's historic district. Thomas spoke to the receptionist, booking 2 separate rooms, telling me, "I don't want you to feel uncomfortable. This way you can have your space and I can be nearby if you need anything." His thoughtfulness floored me. After dealing with a family who didn't seem to care, this kindness felt surreal. In my room, the bed looked inviting, with crisp white linens and a fluffy comforter. My eyes burned with exhaustion. Thomas knocked softly, handing me the little cupcake box. "Figured you might want to finish it," he said with a gentle smile. "Are you going to be okay?" I mustered a nod, my voice too tight with gratitude to respond. "Call me if you need anything," he said. Then he left, and I collapsed onto the bed, letting the events of the day wash over me. It was the most disastrous birthday of my life, yet in a bizarre twist, it had led me to someone who treated me with more respect than I'd received in years. The next morning, I woke up feeling groggy, my head pounding with leftover stress. Memories of the previous day flooded back. My mother's dismissive attitude, Tracy's smirks, the humiliating moment with the plates, and then Thomas's unexpected kindness. Glancing at my phone, I saw several missed calls from unknown numbers and a handful of texts from Tracy. My stomach clenched as I read them. "Where did you run off to?" one message said, followed by, "Stop making a scene, Amy," and eventually, "Mom's mad. You better apologize soon." Apologize? For what? For being left behind on my birthday, or for being forced to walk and then treated like a servant? As if that weren't enough, I noticed notifications from my bank. There were charges on my credit card, ones I didn't recognize, each for a few $100s at high-end clothing stores. Confusion turned to horror as I realized the pattern. For the past several days, purchases had been made at designer boutiques, adding up to a painful sum. I called the bank to confirm. They told me the charges appeared legitimate, as the card number was used physically or online with the correct credentials. My thoughts flashed back to when Tracy had asked to borrow my card details for an emergency months ago, and to my mother, who had also taken note. The realization that my own family was making secret purchases behind my back crushed me. Rage and heartbreak collided inside me. How could they do this? I felt so betrayed. My phone rang and I picked up without checking the caller ID, expecting a bank representative. Instead, I heard Helen's sharp tone. "What is this nonsense about you canceling the credit card?" she snapped. "Tracy and I have shopping plans today. We can't be bothered with your melodrama." I sucked in a breath. "You're using my money without asking," I said, my voice trembling with anger. She let out a dismissive huff. "You have a good job, Amy. Besides, we're family. What's yours is ours. Don't be so stingy." My chest tightened. "This is stealing, Mom. I never authorized you to do this." She laughed coldly. "Stealing? Don't be ridiculous. We're your mother and sister. We raised you. We deserve a little help. It's not our fault you have enough money to spare." My teeth clenched. I told her in no uncertain terms that I was cutting off their access, then hung up before she could retort. My hand shook as I placed my phone down. A knock sounded on my door, and Thomas's concerned face appeared when I let him in. "You don't look so good," he said gently. I explained everything, fighting tears of anger and betrayal. He looked outraged. "That's not just emotional abuse. That's financial abuse too. And it's illegal." I knew he was right, but the idea of taking legal action against my own mother and sister made me feel nauseous. Till I had to protect myself. Thomas offered to accompany me to talk to a lawyer if I decided that was best. "I can't stand by and watch you get taken advantage of," he said, a protective edge in his voice. Overwhelmed and grateful, I agreed. We left the inn, and I checked out, determined not to return to my mother's house anytime soon. I caught a cab back to my small apartment where I tried to calm down and think this through. My phone rang again, and this time it was my dad, Stephen. He sounded exhausted. "Amy," he said quietly, "what's happening? Your mother and Tracy say you're throwing accusations around." I felt a spark of fury. "They've been using my card without permission," I said. "They racked up thousands of dollars in purchases." "Dad, how could you not know?" He sighed. "I've been working a lot. I had no idea they had your card info. Listen, can we meet up and talk this out as a family?" My heart pounded. The last thing I wanted was another confrontation where I'd be outnumbered, but maybe this was a chance to force them to acknowledge their wrongdoing. Still, I refused to meet them alone. I told him I was considering getting a lawyer. He sounded distressed, begging me to settle this privately. "Your mother, she might not react well to legal threats," he murmured. "She's always been prideful." I rolled my eyes. Prideful was putting it mildly. "Dad, I'm done being trampled on." They humiliated me, stole from me, and acted like I'm the one in the wrong. He was silent, so I hung up. My heart hammered with the realization of what I was about to do. Even if it ripped the family apart, I couldn't let them get away with it any longer. Thomas helped me find a local lawyer named Rebecca Hayes, who specialized in financial fraud cases. We scheduled a consultation, and when the day came, I sat in her office, wringing my hands as I explained the situation. She listened intently, her expression growing increasingly disapproving as I recounted the details. "Unauthorized credit card use is a serious matter," she said. "Family or not, what they did is illegal. The question is, how do you want to proceed?" I felt tears sting my eyes. "I just want them to stop and repay what they took," I said. "But if they refuse, I'm prepared to sue." She nodded. "We can start with a demand letter, clearly stating the amount owed and the consequences if they don't comply." The next day, a neatly typed letter went out to my mother and sister, demanding immediate payment for the unauthorized charges. I included proof from the bank statements, along with warnings that further legal action would follow if they ignored it. When I sent copies to my father, he called me in a panic. "Amy, do we really have to do this?" he asked. I took a steadying breath. "Yes." "I'm not backing down." He sighed and said, "Your mother wants a meeting. She said we should all get together and discuss this face to face." Although dread settled in my gut, I agreed on the condition that my lawyer could be present, and I insisted it happen at a neutral location. We ended up convening in a conference room at Rebecca's office. My mother arrived with her usual air of superiority, wearing a designer blouse, while Tracy slumped beside her, looking annoyed. My father trailed behind, looking older and more tired than ever. Thomas came along to support me, though he stayed quietly near the back, letting Rebecca handle the legal talk. Helen frowned. "This is ridiculous," she said. "All these theatrics for a few shopping trips?" I could almost feel the anger simmering in my veins. "Those few shopping trips cost me thousands," I snapped. "You never asked, never even told me you were using my card. You treated me like a doormat and then acted shocked when I stood up for myself." Tracy scowled. "Why are you so dramatic, Amy? You have a decent job. You won't miss the money." I stared at her in disbelief. "The point isn't about whether I miss the money. It's about respect and trust." Rebecca tapped a folder on the table. "Let's be clear," she said firmly. "Any unauthorized use of someone else's credit card is fraudulent, can be pursued civilly or criminally. We're here to settle this matter responsibly, not to tear a family apart. But if you refuse to repay the amount owed, Amy has every right to escalate this." My mother crossed her arms. "So you'd send your own mother to jail," she sneered. I felt a stab of guilt, but I reminded myself they were the ones who put me in this position. "I don't want that," I said. "I just want what's fair." Eventually, we reached a shaky agreement that they would repay the charges in installments. However, as the days passed, it became clear they had no intention of following through. My mother posted on social media about going on yet another shopping spree, while my sister flaunted her new clothes and photos. Furious, I informed Rebecca that I was ready to move forward with a lawsuit. We filed the paperwork, and the official court process began. Seeing the seriousness of it all, my father begged me to reconsider, but my mother and sister's arrogance sealed their fate. Trial date was set, and my nerves nearly overwhelmed me. Thomas stood by my side every step of the way, offering words of encouragement. In court, Rebecca presented the evidence clearly. The bank statements, the timestamps matching when my mother and sister were using the card, and my explicit attempts to make them stop. My mother tried to claim I had given her permission, but the text messages and call logs painted a different story. Tracy looked bored throughout, as though the proceedings were a minor inconvenience. When the judge delivered the verdict, my heart pounded so hard I thought I might faint. My mother and sister were found liable for the unauthorized charges and ordered to repay every cent, plus damages for the distress they had caused. Furthermore, the judge admonished them for their entitlement. My mother's face turned pale, and Tracy's eyes brimmed with disbelief. My father let out a weary sigh, finally realizing just how deep this rift had become. After the court ruling, Helen and Tracy found themselves struggling to cover the debt. They tried to send me frantic messages, claiming they had no means to pay. They even had the audacity to suggest I should forgive the debt because we were family. For the first time, I felt no guilt in ignoring their pleas. My father tried to mediate, but I told him flatly that unless they stuck to the judge's order, there was nothing more to discuss. He shook his head, acknowledging I was right. The tension weighed on all of us, but I also felt a strange sense of relief. Finally, I stood up for myself. In the midst of all this chaos, something unexpected happened. I started feeling nauseous in the mornings and noticed I was more emotional than usual. Concerned, I visited my doctor, who confirmed I was pregnant. The news floored me. Thomas and I had grown close over the weeks. He was no longer just a stranger who rescued me on my birthday. He had become my confidant, my ally, and now the father of my child. When I told him, he looked stunned for a moment, then broke into a radiant smile. "We'll figure this out together," he said, wrapping his arms around me. "You're not alone." Pregnancy changed my perspective on many things. I realized I wanted my child to have a chance at a better family dynamic than I did. Yet the pain my mother and sister had inflicted was still raw. For some time past, my father called me again, saying my mother wanted to offer a genuine apology. Against my better judgment, I agreed to meet them, but only in a public place and only if Thomas came with me. We met at a small cafe near the waterfront. My mother looked weary, her once proud posture sagging, and Tracy kept her eyes lowered. They stumbled through an apology, admitting they had treated me horribly. Tracy mumbled something about not realizing the damage they were doing. Part of me wanted to lash out, to scream that it was too late. But another part felt exhausted by anger and sadness. "I'm pregnant," I said quietly, and their eyes widened. My mother started crying softly, while Tracy's jaw dropped. "I don't expect us to magically fix everything," I continued, "but I also don't want my child to be born into a family full of hatred. If you truly mean to change, then prove it by respecting boundaries and fulfilling your obligations. Don't just say the words." They both nodded, tears in their eyes, promising they would. My heart was cautious, knowing words are easily spoken but rarely honored. Thomas took my hand under the table, squeezing it gently in reassurance. We left that meeting with an uneasy truce, not a real reconciliation but at least a step away from open hostility. Over the following weeks, they made partial payments toward what they owed, and my mother even sent occasional messages asking how I was feeling. Tracy kept her distance, but she also stayed out of trouble, from what I heard. As my belly grew, so did my resolve. I decided that my life would no longer revolve around pleasing people who gave nothing in return. Thomas and I began looking for a new place in a quieter neighborhood, somewhere we could raise our child in peace. I also took a promotion at work, channeling my energy into building a stable future for our growing family. I stayed in contact with my father, who seemed genuinely remorseful about not intervening sooner. He helped me navigate some financial details and we grew a little closer. The day finally came when my mother and sister completed their court-mandated repayment. I could tell it stung their pride, but I had no sympathy left to spare. By then, I was 7 months pregnant and too focused on the upcoming arrival of my baby to dwell on their discomfort. One afternoon, my mother dropped off the final check, and instead of storming away, she hesitated. "Thank you," I said, tucking the check into my purse. She opened her mouth, her eyes glistening, and whispered, "Amy, I truly am sorry for the way I treated you. I was so used to taking that I never thought about how it hurt you." For a moment, I saw a flicker of sincerity in her gaze. I didn't respond with a grand gesture of forgiveness, but I nodded. "I hope you mean it," I said softly. "I want us to try for my child's sake. But it'll take time." She nodded in return. Then she left, and I closed the door, feeling that perhaps the cycle of hurt could end here if she chose to become a better person. Thomas came up behind me, resting a hand on my shoulder. "You okay?" he asked. I leaned against him, resting a hand on my stomach where I felt a gentle flutter. "I think so," I said. "It's not a perfect ending, but it's something. And maybe that's enough." In the months that followed, I learned that healing doesn't happen overnight. My mother and sister still had moments of selfishness, and I still wrestled with trust issues. Yet Thomas and I forged ahead, building our own family on a foundation of mutual respect and love. I knew the future might bring new challenges, but at least I would no longer be alone in facing them. When my baby finally arrived, healthy and perfect, I felt a surge of hope. I held that tiny life in my arms and understood that every tear, every betrayal, every moment of heartbreak had led me here. This was a new beginning, a life where I could decide who was worth keeping close and who would remain at a distance. Looking back, I realized my birthday debacle was the catalyst that pushed me out of the cycle of compliance. It was painful, humiliating, and enraging, but it forced me to see how little my family valued me. And it led me to Thomas, who showed me what true kindness could be. I no longer measure my worth by whether my mother or sister approve of me. Instead, I've learned to set boundaries, demand respect, and surround myself with people who genuinely care. My story isn't one of perfect reconciliation, but of personal growth, a journey from being overlooked to finally finding the strength to stand tall. And for that, I am forever grateful. Even as I settled into my room at the Blue Orchid Inn, I replayed every moment of the night. My mother's cruel smirk, Tracy's dismissive shrug, the sting of humiliation. A part of me wanted to deny how deeply they'd hurt me, but the truth was clear. They saw me as someone to be used. I stared at the tiny bedside lamp, thinking of all the times I'd told myself our family was simply a bit dysfunctional. Now I realized it went beyond that. Their behavior was selfish and toxic, and I had spent too many years tiptoeing around their moods. The next morning, I checked out and headed home, dreading the barrage of messages I knew awaited me. Sure enough, my phone overflowed with missed calls and texts. Tracy demanded that I stop acting dramatic, while Mom accused me of ruining a perfectly nice evening. As though it was my fault they left me without a seat on the bus. My jaw clenched in anger, but I was determined not to fold. If they couldn't see my side of things, I wouldn't waste my breath trying to convince them. An even bigger shock awaited me when I noticed strange credit card charges. Luxury clothing stores, expensive accessories, it was all there, adding up to an alarming sum. My heart sank as I realized my family had my card details. Mom had once insisted on having my card for emergencies, and Tracy had used it too. Now they were treating my account like a free shopping pass. Feeling a nauseous swirl of betrayal, I called the bank to freeze my card. That same afternoon, Mom confronted me. "Why'd you cancel the card?" "We needed it." The audacity of her words left me reeling. When I called it theft, she laughed. "Don't be silly, we're family." Later, I slumped onto my couch, tears burning my eyes. All my life, I tried to be the reliable daughter, good grades, steady job, never asking for much. Yet here they were, draining my finances and acting like I owed them. The front door buzzed, and when I opened it, Thomas stood there. He wore a worried expression and carried a small grocery bag. "I wanted to check on you," he said softly. I felt an immense rush of gratitude. We ended up talking about everything: my upbringing, the favoritism, the years I'd spent trying to win my family's love. He listened, offering gentle support. For the first time, I didn't feel completely alone. Determined to protect myself, I consulted a lawyer named Rebecca Hayes. She was calm and professional, reviewing the credit card statements and hearing my account of how Mom and Tracy had used my name without permission. "You have grounds for legal action," she said firmly. "This isn't a misunderstanding, it's fraud." The word hung in the air. I knew taking them to court would shatter any illusion of harmony, but I also knew I couldn't let them keep hurting me. Rebecca drafted a demand letter, asking for immediate repayment and threatening a lawsuit if they refused. My father, Stephen, caught wind of this and begged me to sit down for a family meeting. He sounded remorseful about not intervening sooner. I agreed but insisted it happen in Rebecca's office, with her and Thomas present. Tension in that conference room was palpable. Mom scoffed at the accusation of theft, and Tracy called me over-emotional. My father looked pained but said little. When Rebecca outlined the legal consequences, my mother actually rolled her eyes. "Are we really doing this?" she asked, as if she couldn't believe I had the nerve to defend myself. I met her gaze, my heart hammering, and said, "Yes, we are." As the lawsuit progressed, Mom and Tracy refused to pay back what they owed. They bombarded me with messages about how I was blowing things out of proportion. But whenever I thought of backing down, I remembered the sting of that night. No seat on the bus, the dirty plates, and their sense of entitlement to my money. I stood firm. In court, Rebecca presented evidence that left no room for excuses. My mother and sister had spent recklessly, expecting me to cover their bills. The judge ruled in my favor, ordering them to repay every cent plus legal fees. Their outrage was almost comical, as if they were shocked that their scheme had repercussions. After the ruling, Mom and Tracy tried half-hearted apologies, but they also claimed they had no way to afford the repayments. Dad apologized repeatedly for not stepping in, but the damage was done. I found solace in Thomas, who became my anchor. We spent more time together, and his kindness never wavered. In the midst of this turmoil, I discovered I was pregnant. Shock and fear collided with an unexpected joy. When I told Thomas, he promised we'd handle it together. "We'll give this child the love your family never gave you," he said, and my eyes welled with tears of gratitude. Hearing about my pregnancy, my father reached out again, saying Mom wanted to apologize. I was wary but agreed to a meeting in a neutral cafe with Thomas by my side. Mom appeared subdued, Tracy unusually quiet. They both mumbled regrets about their actions. I told them there was no quick fix for the hurt they'd caused, and I expected them to respect my boundaries if they wanted any role in my child's life. They nodded, claiming they understood. Only time would tell if they meant it. Over the following months, they made partial payments toward their debt, and their hostility diminished. Dad visited occasionally, attempting to mend our relationship, and Mom called to check on my health. Tracy stayed in the background, no longer flaunting shopping sprees. I remained guarded. I was more focused on building a stable future for my baby, saving money, and planning for my new life. Thomas moved in with me, and we turned the spare room into a nursery. Every step felt like reclaiming control of my destiny. In the end, my child's birth became a turning point. As I held my baby, I felt an immense wave of love, determination, and relief. I knew I wouldn't let my family's past mistakes overshadow this new life. Mom and Tracy, slowly repaying what they owed, approached with caution, perhaps realizing they had pushed me too far to ever return to the old dynamic. I accepted small gestures of help, mindful that trust was fragile. Yet for the first time, I sensed a possibility of change. Maybe they had learned something. Maybe they hadn't. Either way, I stood on my own terms now, no longer desperate for their approval. Looking back, I see how that humiliating birthday dinner forced me to break free from their toxic hold. Had they not gone to such extremes, I might have stayed silent forever. It was painful, but it led me to the support of a stranger who became my greatest ally and eventually the father of my child. My life is far from perfect, but I feel stronger, clearer about what I deserve. No one has the right to diminish my worth, not even family. And though the scars remain, they no longer define me. I define myself by the love I give and the boundaries I protect, determined to make sure my own child never doubts how precious they are. Sometimes I reflect on the path that led me here, realizing how one night exposed years of unfairness. If my mother and sister had shown a bit of kindness, none of this would have unfolded the way it did. Yet I can't regret it because standing up to them allowed me to see my strength. It also led me to someone who showed me that compassion doesn't have to be earned. When I watch Thomas with our baby, I imagine a future built on respect and care. I still feel echoes of old pain, when my phone rings and I see my mother's name or when I recall being overlooked as a child. But now I have the power to keep my heart safe. I decide how much access they have, and I can cut conversations short if they cross boundaries. Even if our relationship remains fragile, I believe change is possible. My mother and sister may never fully grasp how deeply they hurt me, but their apologies, however flawed, offer a beginning. It may never be the bond one once hoped for, yet I have found my own path. That is enough. Each day, I'm more confident I made the right decision. My birthday ended in tears, but it also marked the start of a life where I stand tall, unafraid to claim the happiness I deserve. Now, as the months pass, I see that night as the catalyst for a permanent shift in my life. Embracing my own worth was a gift I never expected, and the true love I discovered feels like a miracle.